What seemed like a temporary truce has erupted into a fresh storm, as Canada counters Trump's aggressive trade tactics with a staggering $20 billion in retaliatory tariffs. The new charges come as a surprise shortly after the two countries said they had made a deal to avoid escalating the trade war. Is Trump short-sighted? And how is the trade war with Canada already hurting the U.S.? Join us as we explore trade war or energy showdown. An unforeseen retaliation as Canada strikes back with quiet force. In a stunning political development, Canada's Liberal Party, led by Mark Carney, has achieved a decisive victory in the federal elections, marking a significant shift in the nation's direction and relations with the United States. The election results, widely seen as a rebuke to the policies and rhetoric of U.S. President Donald Trump, brought to power a chorus of politicians vowing to challenge the Trump administration, setting the stage for their relationship with the increasingly outspoken leaders of the neighboring country. Speaking to a jubilant throng after his election triumph, Carney was at his most eloquent when he said, so simply but directly, "We have survived the American betrayal, but we should always remember how it feels." His comments underscored the extent to which Trump's protectionist politics have split the two nations, especially in terms of trade and diplomacy. Prime Minister Carney is scheduled to meet President Trump at the White House on Tuesday, which promises to be one of the most contentious bilateral meetings in years. The stakes are high, as the two leaders represent nations with deeply intertwined economies and shared interests, yet are now sharply at odds over critical issues. Carney, a former central banker with a reputation for pragmatism and resolve, is expected to confront Trump directly over the tariffs that have strained the U.S. Canada relationship and roiled global markets. Canada has long been the United States' second-largest trading partner, with deep ties spanning industries from automotive manufacturing to agriculture. Free trade agreements such as NAFTA existed for decades, enjoying a mutually advantageous economic partnership between the two nations. Trump's recent imposition of broad tariffs on Canadian imports upset this equilibrium, cascading shockwaves throughout supply chains and hurting businesses on both sides of the border. These bully boy tactics in Canada invoked sympathy for Carney, who was able to rally political clout and ascend to the position of a rallying symbol of Canadian sovereignty and economic strength. The fallouts of Trump's trade war have not remained limited to Canada. In America itself, business sectors that depended on Canadian exports or imports have been impacted, from increased costs to reduced access to markets. Economists have pointed out that the tariffs, used as a safeguard to save American jobs, caused system-level disruption, compelling firms to re-strategize and, in some instances, sack employees. Therefore, Canada has enacted retaliatory tariffs, escalating the tensions. However, U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick sketched out a cautiously hopeful picture in an interview with Fox Business recently, saying a Canadian agreement is possible but would be very complex. His statement bears testament to the intricacy of issues involved, from supply chain interdependence to rule harmonization. Also, in a fiery and impassioned response to the escalating trade war, François-Philippe Champagne, Canada's Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, took center stage at a news conference to condemn the latest salvo of tariffs from the Trump administration. Standing firm before the international press, Champagne lambasted the U.S. president's measures, describing them as completely unjustified, unfair, and unreasonable. His sharp critique came after Trump imposed tariffs targeting metals, a cornerstone of Canada's export economy. Once again, the U.S. administration is sowing disruption and disorder into what has historically been an incredibly successful trading partnership, Champagne declared. These actions raise the costs of everyday goods for Canadians and American households alike, undermining the foundation of economic stability that both nations have worked decades to build. The tensions were further inflamed by remarks from Canada's Foreign Minister, Mélanie Joly, who accused President Trump of wielding the trade war as a tool of economic coercion to annex Canada into what she described as a subservient relationship. In a blistering statement, Jolie highlighted Trump's repeated use of dismissive rhetoric, noting his recent comments on the U.S. Canada border as a fictional line, and his provocative 51st state remarks. This is not just a trade war. It is an affront to Canada's sovereignty and dignity, Jolie asserted. Canada will not stand idly by while our nation is subjected to such disrespect and aggression. This marks the second time Canada has imposed a $20 billion round of retaliatory tariffs in response to U.S. measures. The first wave targeted everyday consumer goods, including American orange juice, footwear, coffee, paper products, and household appliances, sending a strong message that Canada was prepared to hit back where it hurts: consumer markets. Although Ottawa announced an additional $87 billion in tariffs earlier, that action was suspended after Trump temporarily eased some duties. Canadian officials, though, are severely irked by what they characterize as Trump's New World Order of unpredictable trade policy and unilateral action. This ire was evident as officials in Ottawa condemned the U.S. strategy as destabilizing and, ultimately, hurtful to collective economic growth. Champagne and Jolie's declaration is proof of Canada's growing willingness to oppose Trump's tariffs and become a world power. Their boldness shows that Ottawa is not only not backing down, but is also willing to raise the stakes, leaving all options on the table, as British Trade Minister Keir Starmer restated in an expression of solidarity with Canada. The United States-Canada-Mexico relationship, previously characterized as cooperation and shared advantage, stood at a fork in the road after a chain of aggressive commercial actions. The two countries were under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, a cornerstone of North American commerce acknowledged in 2020 through ratification. The agreement, brokered by President Trump during his first term, replaced the 25-year-old North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and was heralded as a modernized framework for economic collaboration. However, the dynamics of this partnership have since unraveled. President Trump imposed a sweeping 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada in March. While this measure was briefly suspended following commitments from both nations to address the flow of fentanyl and illegal immigration into the U.S., the tariff persists for goods that fail to meet USMCA compliance standards. This blanket approach has introduced uncertainty into a trade relationship already strained by escalating tariffs. Over recent months, Trump has also announced additional 25% tariffs on cars, steel, aluminum, and auto parts imported from Canada and Mexico. These policies have disrupted long-established supply chains and imposed significant costs on businesses and consumers in both countries. In retaliation, Canada introduced its own tariffs, levying a 25% duty on $30 billion Canadian dollars, approximately $22 billion worth of U.S. imports, and matching tariffs on an additional $29.8 billion Canadian dollars in response to the metal tariffs. Canada has also targeted the U.S. auto industry, imposing tariffs on cars imported from its southern neighbor. The tit-for-tat measures have escalated into a full-blown trade war, with profound economic repercussions. For the United States, Canada represents 14% of overall trade, its second-largest trading partner. It is the #1 importer of U.S. exports, which in 2024 reached $349.4 billion. Energy and automobiles are major exports, highly susceptible to recurring trade tensions. In doing so, Canada is dependent on the United States' market and receives more than three-quarters of its exports. First and foremost are steel, aluminum, and softwood lumber. Softwood lumber is specifically important, and more than 30% of all softwood in the United States is provided by Canadian imports alone, which accounts for over 80% of their imports. The prolonged trade war has ruined industries on both sides of the border, raising costs, creating shortages, and halting growth. With the two leaders nearing their make-or-break summit, the specter of those tariffs hangs large. Mark Carney's government is more anxious to rescue Canadian industries and cut a deal to escape the economic morass, while Trump policies have enraged American companies and consumers reeling under the impact. The stakes in this trade war go well beyond short-run economic policy and represent a trial of the established friendship between the two countries. If left unsettled, mounting tensions risk resetting not only their commercial relations but also the underlying geopolitical balance in North America. The spillover effects of Trump's trade war have percolated throughout the U.S. economy and hit companies of all shapes and sizes, from multinational giants to small businesses and even local retail and tourism sectors. The tariffs cost, added to slowing cross-border economic activity, has caused suffering for trade-sensitive industries and Canadian consumer expenditures. Similarly, General Motors, a stalwart of the U.S. auto industry, is taking the hit. CEO Mary Barra recently revealed that tariffs will cost the automaker anywhere from $4 billion to $5 billion this year. The eye-popping cost shows how mass manufacturers struggle to deal with increased costs of imported components and materials, essential to sustain production lines and offer competitively priced goods. Smaller businesses are also bearing the brunt of the trade war. Beth Finbo-Beniki, the owner of Busy Baby, a company specializing in baby products, told CNN that shipping a container of inventory to the United States now costs her nearly $230,000, a sharp increase that significantly cuts into her profit margins. These added costs leave smaller enterprises particularly vulnerable, as they often lack the resources to absorb or offset such expenses. Beyond direct trade, ancillary industries such as tourism and retail have reported significant losses tied to reduced cross-border activity. The Federal Reserve's latest Beige Book report details a material drop in cross-border tourism, with American retailers and hospitality providers in regions like northern Washington and southern California noticing fewer Canadian visitors. This decline has hit local economies hard. Canadian tourists, once a reliable customer base, now spend less in the United States due to retaliatory tariffs and a growing sense of economic nationalism. Canadians, too, are shifting their consumption patterns in response to the trade war. For example, Canadian shoppers have begun boycotting American-made goods, opting for Italian tomatoes over Californian ones. Ontario and Quebec produced meats instead of Ohio-made pepperoni, and sparkling water sweetened with Canadian maple syrup in place of Coca-Cola. The trend reflects a broader sentiment of resistance and self-reliance among Canadian consumers who perceive the tariffs as a direct assault on their country's economy. "We, as Canadians, don't go out and try to create fights," said Dylan Lobo, a Toronto-based entrepreneur who operates Made in Canada, an online directory promoting Canadian products. "It's an attack on Canada." His remarks underscore the growing discontent among Canadians who view the tariffs as economic aggression and a challenge to their national identity. The effects of those actions demonstrate how deeply enmeshed the U.S. and Canadian economies are, with effects on one border guaranteed to spread to the other. The longer the trade war drags on, the more ingrained the economic damage becomes. It threatens the very existence of business leaders and employees, and erodes the goodwill that has long characterized the U.S.-Canada relationship. As their leaders sit down, they are under mounting pressure to provide solutions to these questions and map a course towards collective economic prosperity. Still, Carney's recent trip to Washington will test the political will and diplomatic finesse of both leaders. It is a chance for Carney to reaffirm Canada as a hard but independent ally who is not intimidated by coercive tactics. It is a way for Trump to weather the storm on his trade policies while taking care of the larger implications for America's global standing. Anyway, as the tit-for-tat trade war rages on, the stakes are rising, not just for North America, but for global economic stability. With tensions running high and retaliatory measures piling up, the question remains, how far will this conflict go? And at what cost to both nations? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.